So I'm very happy to be here to be a part of this panel tonight, even though I don't deserve. I mean, my my buddies on the panel know more about this topic than I do, but I know enough about it to, I think, say some pretty interesting things about what that moment meant to me of the Neighborhood Film Project. I mean, the Neighborhood Film Project is, I lived in the Summit University area when I was in graduate school. And that's, the Neighborhood Film Project is one of the places where I first saw third world Latin American art cinema. Where even the idea of there being a Latin American art cinema was a thing that we could talk about, because we didn't talk about that in classes. So it was really important to me. And I remember the Neighborhood Film Project was the first place I saw this movie called The Other Francisco. That is, if you've never seen it, you should see it. I have a copy of it, actually. And it's a film about slavery in Cuba, but it's a film that taught me so much about what doesn't get shown about slavery in the United States, about the slave experience. It's the first place I've ever seen a bloody slave revolt, for example, and not sort of Gone with the Wind kinds of, slaves being fanned and that kind of stuff. And it was just an eye-opening experience for me. So, one of the things that happened was that we lost touch. I lost touch with Gary Cunningham and with the other people who were part of the Neighborhood Film Project, except for a friend of mine, Setu Jones, who was the person who finally connected me with you again. And we were, one of the things that made this kind of made this moment possible for me was Simona, who was in my class at Macalester. And so we talked about, at some point I mentioned to her that I had seen The Other Francisco and The Last Supper at the Neighborhood Film Project, and what an incredible experience that was, but how I had never been able to find the background, the archives of the Neighborhood Film Project, even though I had looked in Film in the Cities and in the archives of the Historical Society, and then Simona just chased it down. She chased down what the background was for that project. So we should all be very grateful to her, because she didn't let it die at all. She went and found Gary, and she went and found other people, and she has put this together this evening. A lot of this is her responsibility. So before I go on and on and on, which I can do, I want to turn over the conversation, open up the conversation to everybody.
Sure.
Okay?
Yeah.
All right.
Well, I'm Gary Cunningham, and presently I run an organization called MEDA, which works with entrepreneurs of color to get them to the next level. But Leola really makes me feel humble and makes me kind of feel good that we had some impact on some people in a small subset of a period in time, a moment in time. And I got involved through this project. Oh, thank you. Yeah. I got involved with this the neighborhood. It was the neighborhood film project, and then turned into the neighborhood media project because I was volunteering with uh, uh, Neil Sealing, who's not here, who lives in California now, and Bill Schroyer, Denise Mayotte, Nadira Devon, I believe, and a whole group of us were. Excuse me. Shada, I was going to mention her, Shada Biobi. And we, over time it kind of grew, but we started off at this place called Northern Sun Alliance, which was on the corner of Bloomington and Franklin. And I was actually, had just finished a stint with the co-op movement and was working for Pillsbury as a research and development technician. But I was actually looking for some other ways to plug into social change and social activity in my community. And I started volunteering at Northern Sun, which was a safe energy, anti-nuclear weapon, anti-nuclear group in the community. And Neil actually got fascinated me because he was already doing some work showing some movies around this issue of safe energy. And we started planning. At that time, the big issue at the time was 3 Mile Island. And the other big issue that was going on at the time was power lines, and then building power lines across the state of Minnesota. And then another was the issue of South Africa and the issue of apartheid. And so these issues were all important to me. And I think they were important to all of us. And we started thinking and talking about how we could actually educate people more about these issues and use those issues as an opportunity for people to actually take more control of the media and what happens to them in the community, because the images, the pictures, the stories that get written about communities, indigenous communities, people of color, and other groups that are marginalized in our society are not the stories from them, but they're stories that get told about them. And we started thinking about how we would do that, and we actually started just showing a movie somewhere. And we started having kind of a big response. I mean, it was, a couple hundred people would show up for a screening, right? And we were like, wow. And we didn't really know what we were doing, let's be honest. We had no clue of what we were doing at the time. And we had kind of this raggedy equipment, film projectors and bulbs would go out in the middle of screenings. Films would burn because we really didn't know what we were doing. And Neil had a connection to New World Cinema and a couple of other of these West and East Coast outlets. And that really helped us then begin to select movies, and we'd go and work with community organizations and people and ask them what they wanted to see, right? And so it wasn't about what we wanted to show in our political agenda. It was really began to be about what other people wanted. And so we ended up being at the Indian Center showing movies on Bruce Lee, and I mean, just whatever people wanted to see. Richard Pryor, we weren't like all politically correct back then. And it was a powerful experience because people in the community would respond to this in a way, and then we could actually mix in the social message with that which was important to them. And so it just became a powerful piece. And then the Walker Arts Center, Film in the Cities, which is no longer in existence. We started co-sponsoring programs. We did a film. We started doing things around different theme months, like Black History Month. We did a number of programs around Black history. We did some programs around American Indian Months, Women History Month, Latino history. I mean, we did it. We made sure everybody was included. And we wanted to actually do that in conjunction with community organizations. And our idea was we could actually raise money. And we learned something really valuable. The most valuable lesson I got out, one of the valuable lessons, there were many, some painful, but one of the valuable lessons that came out of it was that people actually value things that there's a value exchange for. So when we would show, we started off doing free movies, come to this free movie. Yeah, well, people would show up, some would not show up. As soon as we said, oh, we're going to charge $1 or $2, people actually felt that that was worth something and they would actually pay something to be there. So those were powerful experiences. But there was a hunger in the community for just what Leola said, people seeing things that they hadn't saw, seeing it from a perspective. I remember we brought in a guy named Haile Jarima. Can never forget this guy. He was a character from Ethiopia, and he did a film called Bush Mama, which was such a powerful film about blacks in the United States. So he wrote a book, his whole piece was from the perspective of an Ethiopian looking at black people in the United States. Oh, it was just magnificent, fantastic art. And a fantastic interpretation of someone else seeing your culture and then doing a piece on it that was so authentic to the black experience in the United States. It got at this issue of the universal conditions that we find ourselves in, whether we're in Africa, whether we're in Latin America, whether we're in wherever we're at, there's this universal conditions for the people that have been oppressed within our society have similar kinds of conditions. So for us, for me, it was fun, but it was also learning how to put on a production and figuring out how to do advertising and figuring out how to, what would work and what wouldn't work. And, we were kind of like dream merchants, just like this film here. I mean, this film here was powerful in part because, one, the way the technique in this film was powerful, and what he did there was in terms of the children and the voices, but also what he was doing was showing you the power of media, the power of cinema to transform people, and that those people were transformed right before us in this film. We didn't have that kind of dynamic where people had never seen a movie. But what the dynamic we did have that's a parallel to this is that people hadn't seen the voices of people from around the world in the conditions and the universality of the struggle that people were going through. People hadn't seen that. Or people hadn't seen an African-American person. I remember us going to Stillwater Prison. We had a filmmaker come into town who had done really more artistic type films, Oliver Franklin, I think his name was. And we brought this movie up to the prison, and to see this African-American man that actually took everything he had and invested it in his future as a filmmaker was like, people were like blown away that he would take, and risk everything to be a filmmaker, to tell his story and the story from his perspective of the universe, of the world that we live in. That's some powerful stuff. And so that, these powerful stories and showing those images to young African-American or young Indian, kids or to white people that had never seen black people in these different experiences, just powerful, changed the world. Creating dialogue. So I'll stop there because I could go on. But, I've got Bill and Denise here who could say it from their perspective. But from my perspective, one, I never thought 40 years later I'd be talking about it. But two, the fact that, we consider ourselves what we call cultural workers. That we're trying to use culture to transform society. That it wasn't just about an ideology of Marxist, Leninist, this or that. It was really about how we treat ourselves and how we interact within culture. And that people taking control of their own culture, being proud, being able to name their culture and being able to pull something off within the context that wasn't in the mainstream of media or mainstream what was going on. That's what we were trying to do. So it's hard to explain, but that's my 5 minutes of fame.
Oh, that's really
Well,
great.
you explained it very well.
Very well.
Thank you.
So I don't think it was
Yeah.
hard for you to explain.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Anyway, my name is Franklin Curbelo. I'm going to give you a little background so you understand where I come from. I never had the experience of, about Neil, with the neighborhood projects. But I came to Minnesota. Actually, I was born, down south. I call it down under, but in Uruguay, South America. So, but I call it down under. So I came, 45 years ago, and I remember very well. It was, about summertime, and in my way, from Spain, to Minnesota, I happened to have in my hands a cover issue of Time magazine. And in that issue, it was dedicated to the good life in Minnesota.
Oh, yes, I remember.
When Wendell Anderson, governor, was with the Muskie. So I said, is that the place where I'm going to land? This is paradise. It's wonderful. I mean, I couldn't choose, but a better place to be. And on top of that, it was summertime. So, yeah, and on top of that, I was in another idyllic, town, Northfield, Minnesota,
Northfield.
where that time was called the Three C's town: couch, college, and contentment. That was right there, the sign at the entrance. Anyway, well, I got married, but I had children. Then, I moved to the cities, and then I had the same desire and urge to try, to do something to the community. You cannot just continue to be helping yourself. You have to find some way to understand, your milieu and to understand, how you're going to help to build community. So I got involved, with a group, but what is called, used to be called Committee for the New Song. And the New Song, was a movement, in the 70s that has something to do with a protest song, which, but they started, in Cuba, it started in Chile, throughout Latin America. It was like a tsunami. And because there was a lot of repression. And the way the artists, for that repression was through song, and they paid dearly for speaking their minds and singing. So we were in a way to try to follow that tradition, so we brought, artists to town. We, they promote and have a stage, those artists. And we used to have, what we call regular peñas, gatherings, and on a weekly basis, not weekly, at first it was monthly, and where we invite the community with something that is done very commonly in, throughout Latin America. It's just like a big gathering where people, are like in a family. And people, so we invite, musicians, so we partake. So that was, our job, But then later on, I got, interested, in video and film. And so I approached, the film, Minnesota Television Network, the cable access channel. And right there, I started producing some films. And we have a group of volunteers, and we created a program. It was, a bi-weekly program called, Live Wire.
Remember it.
Remember Live Wire?
I totally do.
It was a very committed, individuals. And then at that time, was the height of the wars in Central America. So we were really hammering hard to try, to bring that perspective, the suffering that took place over there. So people that travel over there or were doing political work, so they have a voice in our show. And so later on, I was very involved, and I continue to be involved with the Minnesota Cuba Committee. And the Cuba Committee has been founded probably almost 25 years ago. And basically what we do is try, to give, about Minnesotans or the United States, a different perspective, which, the main media of, what they, portray. Like Cuba is our enemy, that Cuba is totalitarian. So let's but try to highlight, what are the tenets of the revolution? We are, in a way, we defend the right, Cuba to exist. We respect their sovereignty. We respect, the way, and of course, we don't want United States to meddle, just like Cuba doesn't meddle in the United States, or they want to change the state. So we've been involved, I've been involved in that, and we have brought, by speakers and intellectuals that, but they have the opportunity, to talk to the community and give, their perspective. About 9 years ago, the Cuba Committee started, what is called the Minnesota Cuban Film, Festival, which is going to happen, the ninth, version of that is going to start on March 1st. And we have developed a relationship, with, the Cuban Film Institute. And then, but through them, we're able, to obtain some of the films that we show, what they are. So this is kind of the film is a great tool to open the eyes and their minds of people. It's not about, political talk. It's just the way, but they show how it is a totalitarian, a regime able, to create, have so many artists expressing themselves. There's something, about the, quite right. How come, but in Cuba, education is free? How come in Cuba, healthcare is free? How come, so you wonder, what's going on with Cuba? So we try, to somehow, give, that sense there is something that you have to see for yourself. You cannot obviously, rely on what, but the main media feed you, but that skew, but so anyway, so when Simona, approached me, on that, I say, well, that's great, because, but I really, but the value, but the, these avenues to reach community, to change community, to help, build themselves. So that's, but what I come from. And I have, but through the years, but I've done some reading. I traveled to Cuba a few times. I have, but the limited, but the insight about Cuba because it's so complex. But it gives me, but an understanding about, what makes Cuba tick. And how important, for Cuba is, but to be understood in their own terms. But so it's very important, but the Cubans don't hate the Americans. They hate the foreign policy, American foreign policy. They love America, they like baseball, they like them. So they are part of what I call the larger American family, in a sense. And there's no reason, but the United States have, to, but they continue to, squeeze and squeeze, hoping that, but the people in Cuba will rise and overthrow the government. This is just, but the wishful thinking. It won't happen. It won't happen, about the 50 years. It won't happen in another 50 years. So anyway, this is where I come from, and what, what I espouse, and what, but the, and through films, we like, to give, but, about the viewer another understanding, and then hopefully, prompt them, to go to Cuba. You have to go to Cuba.
I have to go to Cuba.
Yes.
I actually was just in Cuba last year.
Oh,
2
wonderful.
weeks.
For the film festival?
It was the experience of a lifetime.
Oh, yes.
And and just not to interrupt you, Franklin, but
No, that's right.
it was so powerful for a lot of different reasons. But one, art is so revered there.
Yes.
I mean, artists are so revered there. They actually, after the revolution, they had a lot of issues with art and artists and et cetera, and a lot of artists went to Mexico. But then they were like, they woke up and they said, this is who we are. This is like this cultural piece of who we are. And now artists are just like are treated and are respected in whatever the art form is. And so there's all kind of, everyone in school takes an art form. So, so they have all the music and the dancing and the filmmaking. And I mean, it's like, I was totally blown away. And we left Miami. So I was with the grant makers for the environment. And Hispanics in Philanthropy, which is an affinity group for Latinos in philanthropy, and we did this tour. And the only reason I mention this, we leave Miami, and it's all of this intensity with police and crime and all this stuff. We spend 2 weeks in Cuba. We we've probably seen a few police, but
Yeah.
it wasn't like prevalent. It just is a different environment. People, would like to say, well, there's all kind of crime. I'd say, well, I actually didn't really see it. And they have actually, what I found out later, they have one of the lowest crime rates in the world. Right? Now, that doesn't mean there wasn't mistakes and different things like that. But
I just want to add, they have
everybody gets
yeah.
educated. Everybody has
Right.
health care. I mean, there's all these things that everybody has housing. There's not like people living on the streets homeless. Right? I seen like maybe one person that might have been, out of whack or something. But I was impressed with the society. So I just want to add
that's fine.
to everything
I'd like
you
to hear
said that I
Yeah.
walked away like,
Yeah.
oh my God. And, I'm sure there are issues and contradictions, but the fact that our policy, even now under our new president, is that we're going to isolate these folks. They went through a whole period of almost starvation after the Russians
The
left.
special period.
The special period. And that was, for me, it was like, but they survived.
Yes,
That
and
special.
thrive.
Yeah, and they have some of the biggest community gardens in the world. Everywhere you
Organic.
go, there's a community garden. So anyway, I'll stop.
Yeah.
So
I'm just like Cuba crazy.
Oh,
Right?
no, that's really.
I want to go back. Right?
That's very important. But one of the questions that that some member of the audience wants me to ask you is about mobile cinema,
Right.
and to talk about the neighborhood film project in the context of this more global movement that's about showing film in communities, in small communities, and mobile cinema, and how you do that, and what a huge movement that has become in our time. So let me just say this before I move on, and that is that I want to explain that I don't want to speak as the person who entered this work as a graduate student, even though that's true. I did enter this work as a graduate student and figure out what was going on in the Neighborhood Film Project from that point of view. It was because my education at the University of Minnesota was so lacking in any kind of conversation about Latin America or Cuba or anything like that. There was nothing like that in my education. And I was I was hungry for that, because and this is, true in general, that I wasn't born into a family that was set, was trying to move up, and they weren't necessarily, intellectuals. My family actually is from Bluefields, West Virginia, from the coal fields, deep in the coal fields of Bluefields, West Virginia, and I was hungry for an experience that acknowledged the existence of those people too, of the working class in places like West Virginia, and of the sort of multiracial working class, which is what West Virginia is about. There's all kinds of really interesting work that's been done about the coal fields in West Virginia.
Yeah,
Matewan,
Sells.
exactly,
John
Matewan.
Sells, we actually showed that movie here. And John Sells actually sometime later came back, and we did a session at the Walker with him some years later.
Yeah, it's still a great movie. That
Great filmmaker.
Yeah, he's a great filmmaker.
I'm just going to add, if you
No,
allow
no,
me.
go ahead,
Yeah. Let's about the touch, about the phenomenon, that the cinemobile, about the film on wheels, if you will,
Yeah,
or
film on
sometimes
wheels, yeah.
on mules.
Yeah.
Anyway, that but the concept actually didn't start during the revolution. According to my research, this but it started in 1898 in Cuba. They say he bought that person but they went to the countryside with 2 electrical generators and a pathway projector, a very odd projector. And he took, to towns and hamlets, but not everywhere. But from 1902 to 1958, there were few similar projects to take film to the rural area. And guess what? The United States Information Service also had mobile units.
Wow, that's
But of
interesting.
course, the idea, and it was, but run by the U.S. Embassy at the time. And it was TV propaganda films and praising the American way of life.
Of course.
That's the way, but the films were lent at no charge. It will provide projector and also a projectionist. And this is the editorial, very generous if you take into account the colonization, penetration of American culture into Cuba.
Right.
So then, comes, the revolution in 1959. And right from the beginning, the revolution had, but the idea that they want to change society. And culture and education was one of the most important pillars of that. So at that time, there were some the efforts, some filmmakers, they were doing, some films before, the revolution, mostly, with the help, Mexico. And because, as you know, about the making a film, it's always a very expensive proposition. But in 1959, when the revolution came, one of the things, revolution it was to bridge the gap between the urban, like Havana, and the countryside. So that was, the major, and they thought, that the film was going to be, but the vehicle, no pun intended, to bring, like you saw, but in the film, but the ability, to see, the film for the first time, and to get, a sense that there is a larger world. And education was a very important part of it, but that's when that was created, but the literacy project, where 100,000, volunteers, young, volunteers, students, sometimes as but young, 12 years old, they went to the countryside, to teach, to read and write to, but the people in the countryside. And so some of them, paid dearly because they were counter-revolutionaries, and some of them were killed. So there was a major effort. So the same thing happened, with, the mobile units. One or two, those individuals, because there was a lot of unrest, just because the revolution won, that doesn't mean, the counter-revolutionaries didn't want, to undermine, revolution. So there's a couple of those, people were killed. And so at that time, the Cuban Revolution created what is called, the Cuban Institute. It's called ICAIC. And the revolution is nationalized the film industry, movie theaters, which means, going to the theater, to a film over there is so cheap. That's why people, flock there, because the rich and the poor can go there because it costs 20 cents, the ticket. Anyway, but one thing, I want to add, perhaps, that you notice, some writers say that, but Cuba is not just a socialist, it's more surrealist than socialist, but the country. I mean, when you go there, but you enter into a world, for the first time that you didn't think, but is this things happen? Like, but the cars, the American cars are still running. But a lot of things, that you wonder, but is this, frozen in time? I mean, it's not. The revolution has, but I mean, this is, what some people think. There's a air of surrealism that is unique, to Cuba. There's no other place in the world that create that feeling. Somehow, you have perhaps, noticed that. And obviously, but your short visit, it gives you kind of a glimpse how people, but things, about the 50 years of embargo has, but they take its toll. So on the outside, they are smiling, but on the inside, they are suffering. There's a lot of suffering.
Oh, yeah.
And the houses that you see and the outside, the facade may not be as, but they fit to live inside.
Yeah, and it's certainly not utopia, but so I'd say that, and there's certainly a lack of economic means, and the economic system certainly isn't perfect. So I want to be clear about that. I think I actually was there during the Cuban Film Festival, so the film festival was going on, and it was all these stars from the United States going to see this, the Cuban film, because I think in part because they're creating a different art form than what we see here in America, and people are learning from this powerful island of people that are really, and I've been all over the world, and I can tell you it is a unique experience in Cuba. For me it was. Of course, the first book I ever read was History Will Absolve Me by Fidel Castro. Yes. So, you know, it's like I've got a little history here. Yeah. But, you know, so the mobile films, you know, it's hard to compare this because we're in this different age. Right. So this little thing here, I can do a whole movie on now, right? And if you think back in the 80s, we were carrying around these big old film things, huge projectors, the idea that it was, we could put it all in a bus and take it around, that, something that people were doing at the time. But now we're in a different era. So what, my question today is, how do you create community? Mm-hmm. How do you use film as a film or this medium of images? How do you use that actually to build culture, to build efficacy by the people in the community? How do you use that when people aren't gathering in places as much, only in terms of the action films or what have you? But the question of how do you instill or reinstill? My daughter runs a cafe in North Minneapolis called Breaking Bread Cafe. And every time I walk into this cafe, I get the feeling of the media project. And I get it because they are creating community, right? And that's what we were doing. We were really creating community. And you walk in there and people are treating each other like community, and they're acting as if they're community in a space of all these different cultures walking in and out the door. And that's part of what we were attempting to do, and part of what we were doing, even though we didn't really know it at the time, is we were creating a place where people could gather, where they could have a shared experience, where they could talk about that shared experience. Bill showed me one of our posters about the new intolerance of the right. Right, and I was like, we could have shown those films today, right? The new intolerance. So the question, which is kind of sad, but at the same time, we were creating a space for people to have the conversations about the politics that were going on at the time. We interacted with the Twin Cities Committee for the Liberation for Southern Africa. And we were working with them, and because they were protesting at the university. And in fact, the University of Minnesota was one of the first universities to pull back from their investments in South Africa. That led to, believe it or not, today, I'm in a meeting today, right? We're showing movies on South Africa. We're part of this movement that was going on. And that was the first social impact investing, which is huge today, started from that very moment of us working together. We didn't know what we were doing, but we were protesting investments that our university was making in a system of more or less slavery of Black people in South Africa that has now led to everybody wants to do social impact investing. Everybody points to that moment in time as the moment in time that we are now talking about how do we use our capital and our resources to create social good and social change in community. So the question that I'm asking about this is, how do we now transfer all of that energy into how do we start creating community in a different way today? Because what we did back then, I'm not sure it quite would work in the same way today. as it did then. So I'll just put that out as a question.
It's a good question.
You know,
Obviously, you know, but in order to do that, you have to change a system that is oppressive. Without that, you know, the building the community will be, you know, microcosm. If you're really, you know, great change, you have to create a revolution. I mean, I'm talking about armed revolution, but it's something that starts in one individual, but it has to create, you know, that change from below. There's nothing that's going to come, you know, from above, handed down. So Cuba is an example, but we all need, you know, to revolutionize ourselves, you know, to educate ourselves, to see the injustices, and say, well, it's not enough, you know, to see the injustice and don't do anything about it. That's condoning. So that's why they call it a revolution as well, and a point that you cannot, you know, stay silent. You cannot stay, you know, sitting. You have to do something. And then, of course, you know, that you have to seek, you know, the help of your fellow men and women that will help you to create a movement. That, you know, but you know, the problem is, you know, in the United States, that unless you change the system, it will be harder, you know, to erase the sense of powerless and alienation, you know, but especially, you know, about people of color.
What do you think of that?
Well, you know, I was just thinking about how much my peers at the University of Minnesota underestimated the kind of films that's one of the things I learned from the Neighborhood Film Project, is that people at Hallie Q. Brown will watch an art film.
Yes.
Yes, they'll watch an art film. They're not, you know, too dense to watch an art film. And in fact, you can have a really interesting conversation after that film with those people in that space.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think that was surprising to many of my peers. So I think that's a really important, you know, outcome of your project.
Right,
That it
right.
showed that you know, it's that this art is not just for elites, whatever that means.
Right.
Yeah,
I
whatever that
remember
means.
we did a show at the Walker on a tribute to Black women, and it was a whole series at the Walker. And the director, who was a good guy, Richard, I forget his name, Weiss, I think his name was. He was questioning whether we'd get a crowd and whether people would show up, and all this stuff was going on. And we just packed that place. I mean, the place was filled rafter to rafter with people because people were hungry for the art, for the conversation, for the dialogue, you know, that, and doing it in and we weren't thinking cross-cultural at the time, and it wasn't in my mind anyway. It might have been in Denise's mind. But it was more, this is just the natural outgrowth, because people were learning about each other through this medium, right? I mean, just like you just mentioned, oh, my colleagues didn't realize that, you know, Black people were watching art
films.
Right.
Exactly.
Or they would even consider watching art films as a part of it. So this is just the power that media has, and, you know, just the kids on that film, right? I mean, you know, that just shows you the power of this medium and how it can be abused within that same context, right? Meaning, you know, but just like all of these projects that have these initiatives, you know, and you talk about the revolution, I actually was sitting there saying, well, how could I, as a Black man in Minnesota, not say there needs to be some kind of a systemic change in the structure in the system, given that by every measure, if I live in St. Paul or I live in Minneapolis, on every measure, from housing to employment to income to assets to prison to health, for every measure, my group of people is doing significantly worse, not just significant, statistically significantly worse than every other group. I would be like, I would be like totally crazy to say there doesn't need to be some kind of fundamental changes in the structure of what's going on.
That's the key word.
Yeah. And in fact, the New York Times, Washington Post, USA Today, Forbes have all said for a black person to be in Minnesota, this is the worst place you could be in the United States of America. I'm not making this up. I didn't write that, right?
Oh, right.
They've written that, right? And so, the question of, don't talk about being American Indian, immigrant, et cetera, within our culture today. And so what you're raising is really a fundamental question. Can our democracy, and this is the question we were asking at the Media Project, can our democracy work for everyone, right? Is everybody included in this quest that we have for freedom, justice, and equality, for access to opportunity? Can that work for everyone? Or do 50 years later, 100 years later, or 400 years later, I'm still looked at as something different, or something different about my culture that creates the outcomes that we have in this community, without recognizing that there's something in the society that is creating those conditions. So I just wanted to say, I understand that, but the real question is, I think it has to be uniquely American, right, within its context and its character and its aspects. And we are in a situation where people of color in general, Latinos more specifically, are becoming more and more the majority of this, of our culture and of our society demographically. And I think it's freaking people out. And the response to that is what we're seeing in the backlash of Charlottesville and what's going on around the nation, as the backlash to, we got to take back America and all that stuff. So within the context of film, I'll bring it back to that.
Yeah. No, that's fine. That's fine too.
Yeah, I was wondering, I remember having talkbacks at neighborhood film project films, especially the Cuban films. And that being one of the places where these peers of mine who had a tendency to look down their nose at working class people, or that's where they learned that, those people really do think. I mean, they were like surprised by that. Right. And I wondered how much of a part of your presentation the talkbacks were, and how that worked, because right now, people are reluctant to do that because they're so into film as entertainment. Right. And
that's what I was trying to get at earlier. Is that, but that was a integral and important, and as important, the panels and the conversation after the film were as important as the film itself. In part because people would generate a conversation that they couldn't have elsewhere.
That's right.
And so that was for me, and I think the rest of my colleagues here, we'd say that was as important as the film itself, depending on the genre and the audience, because we did jazz films too, right? I mean, we did a series, but we'd always have, for the most part, I'd say 90% of the time, we'd have some kind of talk back. I like the way you put that talk back.
Yeah.
And they would be in they would be civil. You could have disagreement. If people could actually disagree on issues and not hate the other person. Now, in our current politics, when you have a disagreement with somebody, you hate them, and you'll never speak to them and blah blah blah. But for whatever reason, the venue that we set up allowed people to have more of a dialogue. Right. In fact, I remember learning about the word dialogue from discussion when I was at the Media Project, meaning this issue of having a dialogue is you're really hearing the other person, you're really having a dialogue with them. When you're having a discussion, I'm talking, you're listening, et cetera. And so, and you're trying to figure out what your position is, et cetera, et cetera. And so those kind of conversations, I just remember that Stillwater visit was so powerful in part because one, I walked in there and I knew a lot of the folks in there because I grew up here, right? It's like, you know, people knew me and I knew them, right? Yeah, I mean, this is a culture, right? Yeah, act like I'm separated from my culture because I walk into this place. But the other thing that was powerful about it was they watched the film and then they got into a very deep conversation about that film in relationship to their own lives and what that meant from their perspective. And it wasn't all coated with politically correct or politically this or that. It was really heartfelt and meaningful. And that's the kind of dialogues that we would have in different places. So
I just want to add one thing. You brought, about memory, about going to prisons, showing the film. A few years ago, about the Film Society and the International Film Festival showed a very unique film by an Italian filmmaker. Not only went to the prison, but actually engaged, about the inmates to act, about it. That was an amazing. It's Killing Caesar or something like that. Hardcore criminals. Right. They were transformed by, the ability, to act up. They were just natural actors because the drama, they could bring the drama. But it was a very difficult, about the filmmaking, that. Now, you brought, about the word democracy. I remember, reading that when Gandhi was asking about what's democracy, he said, that's a good idea. He said.
Well, I just, for the record, let me say that I know Bill's trying to get in. First of all, I am a patriot of America. I believe in America. Yeah. I can go back 6 generations of people that have fought and died for this country in America. So I want to make sure that everybody in the audience is aware that there are some deep values here. I just want our country to serve everybody, to work with everybody so that everybody has the same opportunity, not just some people have the opportunity and other people don't. So I actually am a patriot for this country, and I actually believe deeply. I actually believe that we could actually use the market system to create positive outcomes for people. So that's my job on a regular basis, is creating entrepreneurs, right? So that really means that we can use this system to actually create social good, right, in communities and places. But again, not everybody's situated to opportunity in the same way, right? And that it's in our interest so that everybody does. So I just want to put that on the record.
No, I fully understand.
At the same time, I think, getting back to the film, I think that giving access to filmmaking, to film creating, to seeing a shared experience in community for people in community, whatever their age, but particularly for young people, is so critical because it's really our values. It's really who we are. So, this issue of myths, the power of myths, right? The power of creating your own myth, the power of telling the story of the hero and putting yourself in it, right? That's all these stories are about, right? Meaning, I'm the hero, and if a young African kid or a young Somali, a young native child, girl, boy, whatever they are, sees themselves in a picture that shows them as the hero, they can then articulate and see themselves as that in the world. And so what we're doing here with this actually has huge implications for how we actually interact, right? They have a thing called if you are told that you're no good or you're this or that, you actually then live out a stereotype threat, right? If everybody's heard of that reality. What we were doing with movies back then we had that in our minds of setting up a positive image, and then telling authentic stories from the people themselves that have the experience. That's what we were doing. And, and so if we could do more of that now, then it gets powerful. I'm going to stop here. So yes, please. Bill, you want to say something?
You got something? I was gonna ask, one, why did it die?
Good question.
And two, I think we have an incredible mobile cinema system going on right now. It shows at different parks around Minneapolis, close to almost 100 movies during the season. And it's usually just Hollywood blockbusters. So to comment on how we've separated culture from politics, like, you know, yeah, it's like culture is entertainment, and there's not very many that will go in, you know, use it for politics. And politics is a whole nother thing, which is, you know, totally, it has a lock and key on our minds. I mean, even in the comment when you were talking about Cuba being economically depressed and not an economic utopia, you didn't put in the counter that U.S. embargo, which has been voted criminally by all the nations of the world for 25 years, has been going on since 1960. So,
No, I totally agree with that statement about Cuba, that the United States created some of the conditions there. Yeah, I don't call it politics, right? I actually call it education, because there's some politics, there's not a moral other side, right? So this issue of, oh, we're gonna be for people that wanted slavery. Well, there's no moral other side to that argument, right? I mean, what's the moral other side? What's the debate, right? I don't get that, right? I don't get that there's a debate about slavery or stealing land from Native American people, or treating women as a chattel. I mean, there's no, for me, that, you know, that does, politics means there's two sides and you're debating something. I don't get the debate about that. So, you know, I mean, from my perspective, that's not, you know, I mean, if somebody's going to start talking about, we want to put your people back in slavery, or, you know, we want to maintain what is, I just don't think there's another side. I don't call that politics, right? Because that presupposes that there's two sides to that argument, and I don't see a justification for the other side. So, yes, Bill.
We got a mic to use while we open
okay,
the floor for questions.
maybe you could show a couple of these posters. The history of the neighborhood film project that started at Northern Sun Alliance, and you can see from the price on the bottom here, it's $1.50 admission. So I would say that the neighborhood media project, which it became, could be recreated today, because all these DACA people, all the people, the Me Too movement, all these movements can do the same thing we did. What we did here at the Northern Sun Alliance, we began showing movies. Here's Paul Jacobs and the Nuclear Gang, anti-nuke films. Well, I think Gary and I partially felt that it was limiting to just be against nuclear power. And it had to include nuclear weapons. It had to include other issues. So we kind of became an ad hoc group. And when we got going good, almost all our movies, here's a series of 6 weeks at Wiley Hall in the University of Minnesota, working with the Minnesota Interchange Network. Now, I don't even remember who they were. I do remember working with, you know, the, what's the Film in the Cities and people like that. But we started doing ad hoc things, working with the other groups. So as far as the myth or whatever, we showed entertainment stuff, Duke Ellington for Black History Month, Happy Black History Month. We showed Spike Lee. I think we were the first ones to bring a Spike Lee movie to Minneapolis.
We were.
Was it She Gotta Have It, or what? Which one was it?
That was it. She gotta
Okay,
have it.
so we brought Sun Ra movies for Black History Month, and Sun Ra, talking about myth, he said, I'm tired of history. I want the mystery. I want my story. I want her story. So we used the entertainment side to bring the political side in. And as far as the politics go, a lot of these things became much, much bigger. When we're showing movies about nuclear power, it started involving countries like South Africa. South Africa had a development for secretly developing nuclear bombs, and they were working with Israel. And so people started waking up and going, wow, there's a whole lot of political stuff here. Now, as far as that, now the neighborhood, or Northern Sun Alliance was right across the street from the Native American Center. At one time, it was the American Indian Center, then it became the Native American Center, whatever, and they're right across the street. So in '79, they had a thing called the National Survival Gathering. Gary and I went, I don't remember whether, did you go? Okay. We went out to the Black Hills, the sacred Bahasapa, to defend that from being called a sacrifice area where they were going to strip mine the Black Hills for uranium and whatever gold was left, and then they were going to use it as a nuclear waste repository. So the natives formed what was called a Cowboy and Indian Coalition. The ranchers and the Native Americans, which was not just Lakota, Dakota, it was many tribes, Cheyenne and all these tribes worked with the ranchers to oppose that. Then the following year, 1980, they brought in people from all over the world, people from New Zealand, Maori, people from Peru, and all these indigenous groups and solidarity groups. Some of them, people really knew nothing about the Sami, the indigenous people of Scandinavia. But that political side became so huge. And when you look at this poster, I'll pass it around, you'll go, this could be today. Communicating the right, surveillance, security and silence, the American way abroad, the invasion of, here's Grenada, nobody's backyard. We just invaded Grenada. Resurgence of hate. Does that sound familiar? Sounds like today. This is from 1981. Freedom of choice. When we worked with we showed Richard Pryor movies to raise money, and there were women that said his attitude is very sexist and very condescending. That was the discussion afterwards. The advantage of working on an ad hoc basis is you can work with all the groups that feel unrepresented. And I'll just pass this one around so you guys can see how contemporary it seems. And then as far as my part, this is how we used to make posters. You'd get the stuff from either the library or a catalog, and you just tape it together, turn it into a poster. So this particular one was kind of my final one with the Neighborhood Media Project. I went to Nicaragua, and our co-sponsor on that one was the Central American Working Group, which became the Central American Resource Center, which became the Latin American Resource Center. So there were many successes. But again, you see $2 admission, whatever. We shared that. So we got $1, and the Central American Working Group got $1. That could be recreated. There's a lot of ways to get media. Mobile cinema, stuff like that, that can be done with videotapes. One of the things we did was when we put up 5 monitors, TVs, and then you'd use tape to feed to those areas. So I think that this could be done in some ways again, and don't underestimate the power of media.
I don't need it. So you asked the question, how did it end? And I want to get you to that.
And also here you brought the political and the culture together. But now it seems that impetus that was created in the 70s and 80s has separated again, and now culture and politics are kind of in their separate ways, and we don't see that fire that was back then. Why did that happen?
And before you all answer, I'm going to say that we have about 5 more minutes left for questions. And everyone else is open for questions as well.
My answer to that would be because Hollywood has discovered how to monetize politics, you know, and that there's so many films that I can think of, and actually media representations that are entertaining and political, like Moonlight. That is a really interesting film because of the interesting questions it raises about gender and sexuality, and also about, you know, immigration and, you know, all kinds of and they're all together in the same film. And part of that is because our media industries now have become so diverse and large, and you know, and willing to, able to show all kinds of different stuff. We don't just have to do independent cinema anymore. I would say that that's a big part of it. Yeah.
I just want to add, you know, even though it's not movie unit, but the Film Society is doing a great job to bring, you know, about the films to the Capri. And I remember going there to see, you know, about a movie about the Black Panther, a documentary.
Yeah.
It was packed, and it was discussion, you know, but it was wonderful. That's just, you know, but to show you how powerful it is to show that and to create, you know, bring, and people were coming from all walks of life there. It was a very, I don't know if you were there that
I didn't.
day,
I know about it, though.
but you must have heard. And the Film Society continue, you know, to do that, to try to go into the communities, and you know, and do that. But the Capri, you know, was, you know, but there's something, you know, boy.
What is the Capri? Explain it. I don't know that.
It's a theater, you know.
Theater in North
Yeah.
Minneapolis.
Oh, okay.
It's a theater in the Black community that they're restoring.
They're restoring it
restoring it.
now.
It's a big, you
And
know, restoration.
it certainly has that that aspect. I guess for me, you know, the bill raised the issue of recreating it, and anything's possible. You know, I mean, nothing's original.
I don't mean us.
Bill's going to recreate it by itself. You know, you asked why it ended. I think we were a group of very young people that had a quest to do something, and we didn't have all the skill sets that we needed to actually carry it out and maintain it. Because once you got past the excitement and the thrill, then you had to put together an organization, you had to fundraise, you had to do all these things that none of us really were that super interested in doing, and, you know, managing the books, and, you know, that part of it for me at the time got to be a pretty heavy burden. Felt more burdensome than the fun that I wanted to have doing something else. And I remember we got a grant, because we all worked on it, from the Minneapolis Foundation for $10,000. And believe it or not, I left my job and started working on the media project full time. I'll never forget my grandmother said, "Boy, what's wrong with you? What, you leaving this good job for a $10,000? I said, "This is what I want to do." And the person that gave me the grant, she said to me at the time, she said, "You know, we're giving you this grant, but, you know, we don't expect you to do this for the rest of your life. But as long as you're having fun, continue doing it. And when it stops being fun, do something else." And it was like the greatest advice a young person could have ever gotten from someone, because it was like, oh, I'm really here in this life to enjoy the experience, not to be burdened down with all of this stuff. So the question of, and you see this with a lot of nonprofit organizations today, the question of capacity to carry out a vision, right, Grassroots Solutions, when I was at Northwest Area Foundation, we had Grassroots Solution do an analysis of the community organizing capacity, particularly in communities of color versus larger organizations. And what they found was that a lot of the communities of color have a lot of passion and dedication and wherewithal and knowledge, but many of them lack the capacity because that gets absorbed by the folks that are the larger institutions that then subcontract with the communities of color to carry out X, Y, and Z. So the communities of color, because we don't have that kind of infrastructure, end up being subcontractors for our own destiny, right? And, you know, that's my words, not the reports. But the question becomes, how do you develop and build the capacity that's necessary for Neighborhood Media Project or the transformation of young black men in the community, or helping young Latino folks graduate from college. All of that stuff, the infrastructure just doesn't exist for in our current structure and system. And so how do we build those kind of capacities? And it only can happen if we actually think about how we're allocating resources, time, energy, and education with our community.
So I think we have time for one final question. And here we go.
I just wanted to comment. I love the film, and this forum was terrific. And it's interesting because of the choice of Cuba for that film and this discussion. There are some really interesting parallels between the development of both countries in the histories. Cuba had a native indigenous population that was just destroyed by the Spaniards upon arrival on the island. The Taínos and the Atués were both native tribes to the island that were completely eviscerated and destroyed down to that there are none left, and we're not. Really, in pretty short order, hundreds of thousands. I mean, the magnitude of death and destruction was incredible. Same as the United States has been certainly for a very long time attempting to do the same. And also in the slave trade,
Yes.
The ugly secret, not so secret piece of Cuba's history is the incredible amounts of slaves, incredible numbers of slaves that were brought over to the island. My family is Cuban. I'm American-born of Cuban descent and Spanish descent as well. But I do know that history, and it is ugly. It is a forced enslavement of not only blacks that were brought to the island, forced from the same areas and same places that they were in the United States. And the assimilation patterns were very similar. There were a lot of interesting similarities. And I think that these films and these opportunities to be able to show the films, to talk to the people directly, as you'd mentioned, is really critical. To bring in something that's a little more popular culture. As a young boy growing up in Miami and seeing no one on television that looked like me, but Ricky Ricardo or Desi Arnaz Jr. in that role was kind of funny. But I appreciated it because he was shown as a guy that was, even though his accent was a little over the top and that kind of made me a little crazy, but that was him. But he was well dressed. He was cultured. It was a different image, and that cannot be overstated. And for these populations in the U.S. as well as in other countries, these films, when they show real life and that they speak to those people, that impact and that statement cannot be overvalued because of what it brings to them, this realness in who they are. And I appreciate these efforts, and there may be some political things that, overall we don't know or don't understand from our perspective as Americans, but that is real. and these films are real, and the impact that they have on those populations are significant and very real.
And lasting. I'd just like to take a moment to say, to thank Simona for digging into
Give it up for
this.
Simona.
Yeah. Woo! For digging into this project and not letting it fade away. You know, tracking down Gary. I think she tracked you down, didn't she?
Yeah, she did. I was at the Northwest Area Foundation. I got a call.
Yes.
And she said, I'm Simona, and you worked on the neighborhood media project, neighborhood film project. And I'm at Macalester, and I just want to try to find out what you were doing and why, and asked me a bunch of questions. I just thought it was bizarre. But I said, wow, isn't that something? I was touched. And two, the fact that she actually took 4 or 5 years, at least 4, if not 5 years later, to bring it to fruition to this. So she had a vision, she had some tenacity, and she had a spirit to actually bring us together, and actually brought Neil Seelan and I together after 30. No, don't tell me it's 30. Oh my God. I'm trying to keep it 20. But, you know, I mean, she brought together some old friends and, you know, had me thinking about how are we now using media to transform communities. So thank you, Simona. My testament to you and to the Walker Arts Center for their support.
I just have an announcement. I can't help myself. If you're going to see great Cuban films, come, you know, to the, you know, to see the Cuban Film Festival start March 1st.
Okay.
It's a Thursday, and it's going to run 6, you know, consecutive Thursday up to April 5th, and that is going to be the San Antonio Main Theater, 7 o'clock.
All right. I
So-
will be at one of them. For sure.
Yes,
Okay.
and they are great films, you know, but the end, I have to add, our fringe benefit of the film is not just people coming in to see the film and being entertained. It's a discussion afterward. That's our fringe benefit. That's what you really starting, you know, to instill, you know, a little bit the desire to change and to have the dialogue. So it's very important. I have to add, you know, that that, you know, sentiment was also shared, but, you know, the Cinemobile, you know, but they were directors, film directors were going to the rural areas to have lectures, to have discussions. That was the commitment, you know, that the Cuban had to be able, you know, to make sure that the people, they open their minds and to, you know, unleash, you know, that the power of creativity to use their minds. So anyway, I should thank you.
I also want to thank Leola Johnson. Can we give it up for Leola?
Wow, what a powerful spirit.
Oh, thank
Right
you.
here next to me. Lord have mercy. Thank you.
Good.
Thank you all so much for coming. And again, thank you to our amazing panel and to SBNN for making this beautiful setup and the amazing organizers and the amazing questions. And thank you to the Walker for putting this together tonight.